Where's Justin?
Oh.
Chalupas.
Welcome to the conclusion almost of our study of the Gospel of Luke. I say almost because we thought that we would be able to finish it this evening, but it's already 8:25, which leaves us only 35 minutes. We're already up to chapter 22, verse 39, which means that we are in the home stretch. We know that the Gospel of Luke has only 24 chapters, so these last 4 pages of the translation of the New Revised Standard Version are the end of the Gospel of Luke. Where we finished last time was at the end of the Last Supper, where Jesus is now going out to the Mount of Olives to pray. Mario will start with Jesus prays on the Mount of Olives, verses 39 through 46.
Okay. Jesus prayed on the Mount of Olives. Jesus went out as usual in the mountain of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray to you for pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew among someone's route beyond them, and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup and for me. You may not be with you're done." As angel from heaven uh, appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was the drop of blood falling on the ground. Then he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples. He found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. They are you you see him. He as get up and pray so that you will not fall asleep into temptation.
We've all heard this story before, so we just have the Last Supper, and now they go out to the Mount of Olives, as was their custom. Jesus with his disciples. He goes a bit far from them, so imagine for a moment in an age before we measured, before we were able to say, I went about 30 feet. How did we describe the distance that Jesus went from his disciples? About the distance of a stone's throw. So for the ancient people, that would have been better understood. How far can you throw a stone? That's about how far Jesus went from his disciples. We have the contents of his prayer. Interestingly, 2 of the lines resemble words from the Lord's Prayer, from the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples. One, or actually before he goes off to pray, he tells them to pray so as not to fall into temptation, which is how the Our Father ends. Lead us not into temptation. And then his prayer is this beautiful one. Often in art, you'll see a cup, often filled with a snake or with something in it. The cup of suffering was an ancient symbol of how it is that we suffer, right? That a cup of suffering, it's, what does one call it, a manner of speech, right? He's suffering. He's taken up the cup of suffering. So imagine for a moment Jesus praying, Lord, Father, take this cup away from me. Imagine looking into that cup and seeing the most disgusting thing that you can imagine and thinking, ooh, I have to drink this. That's what suffering was like. This bitter thing that, sometimes in life when we suffer, it's this bitter thing that we swallow. And so take this cup away from me, but then he concludes again with words from the Our Father, not my will, but thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We hear these words from the Our Father. Interestingly, we have here one of the few appearances of an angel to Jesus in the scriptures. In the temptation story that we heard on Sunday, we heard that Jesus, having completed the temptations, the angels came and ministered to him. Here we have a story of how it is that an angel came and strengthened him. Unfortunately, we don't have any other details apart from that. We know that angels in the ancient mind were messengers of God, connecting us to the heavens. So somehow God sent an angel, we're led to believe according to this story, to encourage Jesus, to give him strength. Jesus continues to pray. His sweat is like blood. Those who work in medical professions have struggled to try to help us to understand what this could be like. Was he in such intense agony that blood was actually coming out of his pores? At least in Luke's mind, Luke is painting that picture. Jesus, after praying a stone's throw away from his disciples, comes back to his disciples, whom he had told to pray lest they fall into temptation. Does he find them praying? A beautiful story on human weakness. How it is that he comes back and finds his disciples asleep, exhausted, tells them, get up and pray. Why? Lest you fall into temptation. Of course, we know where this story is going and how it is that one of the 12 has already fallen into temptation. Becky, that brings us to the arrest of Jesus. That's chapter 22, verses 47 through 53.
While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me, but this is your hour when darkness reigns.
So we gotta love the symbolism of light and darkness for our ancient ancestors. Remember, they lived in a very bifurcated world. Everything was one way or another. So for them, just take a look at the day. It's either light or it's darkness. It's either night or it's day. So the symbolism that we saw in the first reading for this coming Sunday's gospel of Abraham looking up at the dark sky and then seeing this symbol of light where God appeared to him, we see these symbols of light and darkness. The crowd led by Judas, who is betraying Jesus with a kiss, what should be a symbol of love and affection, in this case, is a symbol of betrayal. The one that I kiss is the one that you should arrest. They come with swords, and Jesus's crew is ready to defend him. Lord, shall we fight them? One of them even strikes the ear of the servant, who in another gospel is named. In another gospel, his name is Malchus. Malchus's ear is cut off, but in this story, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus touches him, and another incredible sign, the servant is healed. And then Jesus gives us the final, his words. You know, every day I was in the temple preaching. You couldn't come and arrest me there? Of course they couldn't. Why couldn't they there? Because the people would have risen up against them, right? So instead they go out to arrest them at night. And of course the symbol of darkness is there, right? This is your hour. This is the hour in which darkness is going to win over light, at least seemingly, for the next 24 hours. A few days later, we know that light will win over darkness. But at this point in the story, looks like darkness is winning. That brings us to Jesus being disowned by Peter. That's verses 54 through 62. Mark?
Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard that sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly.
Whoa, this is a dramatic story. Luke is often pictured as a painter and is the patron saint of painters because he paints very vivid stories like this one here. This is what a tremendous story we have of Jesus being led off to the house of the high priest. So who's going to condemn him at night? Interestingly, according to the Jewish law, you could not condemn a person at night. You had to wait until the dawn, right? Everything had to be done in the light of day. Is that what's happening here? No. He's framed in the darkness of the night where darkness seems to be winning. That he's taken to the house of the high priest. Peter is at the fire outside. Jesus had already predicted that Peter was going to deny him, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And now Luke paints that picture of a servant girl saying, "Hey, you're with him, right?" "No, I am not." 3 times he disowns Jesus, denies being acquainted with Jesus. Even the 3rd time, they say, "You're a Galilean." How would they know he was a Galilean? Likely from his accent. Your accent gives you away, says another gospel. And still, Peter denies it. Luke doesn't stop there. In this story, Luke paints the picture, which other painters throughout history have taken up, of the rooster crowing and of Jesus looking at Peter at that moment.
1 time or 3 times?
Just at the end. Yeah. Peter denies him 3 times, as Jesus said he would. The rooster crows, and Jesus looks back at him. Painters, I'm thinking especially, what's the name? There's a Dutch painter who paints very dark scenes who painted this scene exactly like that, with the rooster crowing in the corner of the picture, with Jesus, bound inside the house, looking out into the courtyard and seeing Peter, who has denied him 3 times, as he suggested he would. Peter recognizes what he did, and obviously is contrite. He weeps. Yikes, Terry Ann, that brings us up to the guards mock Jesus and Jesus before Pilate and Herod, verses 63 through 71.
The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy! Who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips."
Famous story again. We'll hear it again on Palm Sunday when we read the Gospel, the Passion narrative according to Luke. They mock and blindfold Jesus, saying, "If you're a prophet, tell us, who hit you? Prophesy." Prophet. Daybreak comes. They're still interrogating him. "If you're the Messiah, just tell us." Jesus says, "I can't tell you, but I do tell you, the Son of Man will be seated at God's right hand." Suddenly we have this image. The ancient people had this image of God being seated on God's throne in heaven, and who is sitting at God's right hand? Well, God's servant, God's Son, the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One. So Jesus is essentially painting this picture that he is the one, the Son of Man, the promised one, who will be seated at God's right hand. So you are the one. And we get the same response that Jesus later shares with Pilate. You say that I am. Doesn't own it, doesn't say it himself. Of course, in the story of Luke, we have a story that's written some 55 years after the event. So we often, when we read the story, we're tempted to think that someone was writing it down as it happened, or was writing it down the next day. How many years roughly did it take for them to write down this story? 55 years-ish. 50 to 55 years.
Rembrandt was the.
Rembrandt, there we go. Thank you. Very haunting and dark. Rembrandt is known for the darkness in his paintings anyways. So for Rembrandt to paint that scene, you know, with the fire blazing, with Peter and Jesus looking at one another, it's pretty haunting. Rembrandt. Chapter 23, Adrian. Let's see. You're going to take 1 through 25-ish?
Sure. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked Jesus, Are you the king of the Jews? You have said so, Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and had come all the way here. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He piled him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, You brought me this man as one was exciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. But the whole crowd shouted, Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us. Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, Crucify him! Crucify him! For the third time he spoke to them. Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him. But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will.
We were all familiar with this story. Some of the familiar elements then. Jesus is led away to Pontius Pilate. Now that it's daybreak, Pilate is awake, saying that this man claims to be king. He asks him, similar to the question here, well, are you the king? Well, you have said so. Huh. Same response that we had in the chief priest's house. So Pilate says, wait a minute, why am I judging this man? Is he not a Galilean? Send him off to Herod, who happened to be in the city at the same time. We get the famous scene. Are any of us familiar with the Broadway musical Jesus Christ Superstar? In that thing, they sort of play on this with Herod looking for a sign from Jesus. Herod is so excited to meet Jesus. He's heard so much about Jesus, so excited to have Jesus now. In the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, there's an entire song that Herod sings on how pleased he is being in Jesus's presence and how he's looking for a sign from Jesus. The song goes to the effect of, if you are the Christ, walk across my swimming pool, sort of like goading him to provide a sign. Does Jesus give a sign? Instead, Jesus is silent. And so Herod has his soldiers mock Jesus, dress him in a fine cloth, sent back to Pilate. Pilate, in front of the chief priests and rulers, says, I find nothing in this man. I'm just going to punish him and release him. Instead, they say, no, if you're going to release anyone, release the insurrectionist Barabbas. Well, what shall I do with this man? Crucify him. Right? So 50 to 55 years after the events, Luke and those who wrote the other stories, the other Gospels, are trying to explain how it is that Jesus ended up dead. How it is that Jesus, the Son of God, could be crucified. And so in this story, we have the people clamoring for his crucifixion and Pilate giving in to the crowd. Remember, there are two sources of power and influence in this world: organized people and or organized resources. In this case, the people organized came together and were demanding something, and so he buckled. Historians would question whether Pilate was really in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. Why would Pilate put himself in the center of all of these persons coming to Jerusalem when Pilate could just as easily stay in his palace far off in Caesarea Philippi or wherever he found himself? Right?
I would argue there's a better case for him being there, primarily because of the threat that you have this massive crowd converging on Jerusalem, right? They dealt with the revolt, right, with Judas the Galilean 20 years earlier, which again is sort of the reference, are you Galilean by any chance? Right, so I'm skeptical. It feels like if you're going to be governor of the province, like the place you need to be is in Jerusalem, where bad things can happen and you can act, rather than Caesarea.
I like that. You're braver than I. If I were Pilate, I would be at the beach and say, hey, Mark, you take care of things down in Jerusalem.
Also, Pilate was recalled just for being by the Romans for being too brutal, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the idea that
Yeah.
somehow he would be like, yeah, I find no fault.
Yeah, exactly.
This is polemics to try to
There you
say
go.
Romans, whom we're trying to spread the religion through your empire, it wasn't you guys.
There you go. Well said. So what Mark is suggesting, historians have pointed out, Pilate was a cruel, cruel person. So the thought of Pilate allowing someone to be taken down from the cross, for instance, was just unfathomable from anyone who has studied history and who knows the type of person that Pilate was. Pilate was a cruel person, according to the accounts that are told.
I find it very interesting, though, that Pilate represents the civil law, Roman law, and Herod, or vice versa, was Jewish, wasn't he? No.
He was a tetrarch, so he was obviously given some rule, some power
Right.
over a region. I think his religion would have been less.
Okay.
Less
Well, what I was thinking
yeah.
is that you had civil,
Yeah.
and then you had religious
Here we have the religious right
coming
here.
together.
Yeah.
And they were wanting to his death sentence to be civil, so that their hands could be cleaned. In my opinion.
Yeah, we do have the religious leaders here represented by the chief
Mhm.
priests. So
Mhm.
Pilate gathered the chief priests and the rulers. Herod would have been more in the ruling class rather
Right.
than being identified with any religion. What we have, though, is this strand of anti-Semitism, even from the very beginning. Anti-Semitism, that word that Joe has used with us before, essentially saying how it is that early writers, especially Matthew, were really laying Jesus's death at the feet of the Jewish people.
Mhm.
It wasn't the Jewish people in the end who crucified him, but in the story,
Right.
it was told we had to find someone to blame. Mark makes a good observation. If I were trying to spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire, am I going to be blaming the emperor for his death? or one of his governors or one of his tetrarchs. And we've got to find some other scapegoat here. Who becomes the scapegoat in history? The Jewish people. And if that were not bad enough that they were scapegoated for that, that lasted even up into the 20th century, 2,000 years later, when 6 million Jewish people lost their lives, right? People look at that historically and say, well, we've had this long history of anti-Semitism, of blaming Jewish people for something over which they had no control. Joe, that brings us to the crucifixion of Jesus, and we're done. Joe, that's chapter 22, verses 26 through 43.
As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who had been on his way and from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who had mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore and breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when their tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two other men, both criminals, who were also led out to be executed, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching. The rulers even sneered at him. He said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine, vinegar, and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews."
Do you want to finish that section, Joe?
One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" He said, "Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished for justice. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve us. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you are in your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I will tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Common elements of the story, we hear them, for instance, every time we pray the way of the cross. Simon of Cyrene helps to carry the cross. It goes back to that tradition that we find in the Gospels of how it is that Jesus was so worn down after being mocked and beaten that he needed help carrying the cross. Women coming out and weeping for Jesus. How it is that there's that extended passage on his encounter with that women. Blessed are the childless, right? These women are essentially, it's better for them not to have had children than to experience the pain that they're currently experiencing. The two criminals with whom Jesus is crucified, later we hear that one is crucified on his right and one on his left. Interesting that Jesus is crucified in the center. Jesus is the center of the story. We couldn't have Jesus off on one side with another criminal being in the center. So Luke, when he tells the story, has Jesus in the center with one criminal on each side of him. They came to the place of the skull. They don't say the Hebrew name. Mark used the Hebrew name. Mark was closer to all of these. And it's interesting that in this case, they don't use the Hebrew name. The Hebrew name for the place of the skull, Golgotha. Jesus was in the center. Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," hearkening back to these other times when we have Jesus advocating for forgiveness. And his clothes are divided by lots, by casting lots, by rolling dice, essentially. That was foretold in Scripture. The early Christians believed that there was a reference in the Hebrew Scriptures of how they would cast lots. Psalm 22, they cast lots for my garments. He saved others. They start to mock him. Let him save himself. The soldier said the same. Let him save himself. The criminal beside him said the same. Let him save himself. But there's one criminal in the story who, by the tradition of the church, has been given the name Dismas. If you know of anyone named Dismas, Dismas was the good thief, or the good criminal, who in this story says, and of course his name is not mentioned in scriptures, which is why we say tradition has given him that name, Dismas, Saint Dismas in the history of the church. We deserve what we're getting, but he doesn't. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus, of course, looks at him and says, what? Today you will be with me in paradise. The last element of the story that we haven't covered is this. There was a sign above him that read, the King of the Jews. In art, we tend to write that as INRI, as an abbreviation. They would have spelled it out, but we don't see many crucifixes with that spelled out. In fact, in the Gospel of John, it says it was written in 3 different languages. The INRI is our shorthand, or an acronym for Jesus of Nazareth, King, Rex, in Latin, Iodorum, the King of the Jews. Remember, in Latin, there is no J, and so the J is written as an I. Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Anytime you see INRI at the time of the cross, what is INRI? That's shorthand for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. We come to the end of our time together, the death of Jesus. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole world. Remember the contrast of light and darkness? It's noon, high noon, should be the brightest time of the day. And yet what happens, according to this? Almost like an eclipse or something. Darkness comes over the earth until 3 p.m. Jesus on the cross for 3 hours. For the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he said this, he breathed his last. If we were saying it in the context of Mass, what would we do at this point in the story? We pause the story and we all kneel for a moment in silence as we reflect on his death for our salvation. The centurion who saw what happened praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. We'll pause there since we're up to the top of the hour almost. What happens after this then is we have the stories of Jesus' burial, but the story does not end there. Instead, we know that Jesus rises. The story had spread 55 years later. The story that St. Paul shared was that death was not the end. Jesus rose from the dead and he appeared to his friends. So we'll have various resurrection appearances, various resurrection stories that we hear in the Gospel of Luke. Questions or comments? Pretty dark. Becky?
Friday at the stations, Father Roy, I can't remember which ones. He said there's several, was it 4 stations of the cross that are not in the, one of them is Veronica wiping the face. What were the other ones? I can't remember what he said.
When Jesus falls,
When he
the
falls.
3 times that he falls.
Oh, okay. Why are they in the stations? Is it just something they added for that? Because
Yeah, excellent
talked about
question.
Simon the Cyrene, that's one of them. You know,
Yeah.
that helps him.
So imagine what we do every Friday with the Stations of the Cross is a liturgy. It's a time of coming together to pray. So imagine the first people who did something like this. The Stations of the Cross were really popularized in the Middle Ages. So what happened was there were many people who could not travel to the Holy Land and actually see these places. And so if you can't go to the Holy Land, we'll bring the Holy Land to you. If you can't walk the Via Dolorosa, the path of Jesus going out of Jerusalem to the place where he was crucified, we'll bring that to you. How did we do that? by placing in our churches the Stations of the Cross. So then we had to figure out, well, what scenes along that road are we going to commemorate, or do we want to hold up for the faithful? And so we naturally thought of, various scenes, like Simon of Cyrene. Oh, helped to carry the cross, because the essential question is, isn't that some story 2,000 years ago, or for them 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages? But what can we learn from this today? How are we like Simon of Cyrene, helping others with their cross? Because ultimately Jesus is in that person who's suffering and who's bearing the cross. How are we Veronica to that person in need? How are we showing them the love of Mary toward her son? In life, how is it that all of us fall? And of course, if Jesus is going to fall, we have to have him fall a symbolic number of times. You can't just fall once. Well, he could just fall once, but in this story, we have him falling not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so in the liturgy that we composed, the time of prayer that we composed for the Stations of the Cross came out to 14 Stations of the Cross. They could have chosen other scenes, but somehow historically, and these are decisions that were made likely some 900 or so years ago, to pull together these certain scenes and to share them as part of the church's tradition. What we pray in the Stations of the Cross is nothing that any of us in this room made up. It's something that was handed on to us by people who handed it on to them, by people who handed it on to them from generation to generation for at least 900 years. The Franciscans were instrumental in spreading the Stations of the Cross throughout Europe.
Father Jimmy, at the Last Supper, I have a painting that was made a long time ago, but I think he predicted that someone was going to turn him in.
That Judas would betray him.
Yeah, Judas.
Huh?
And he's right there saying, I love you to Jesus.
Betrayed him with a kiss.
But he was a hypocrite. Whatever.
Yeah.
But
and in all of these stories, what's so great about these is these people really serve as, what's the word that I'm struggling to call to mind? They're sort of symbolic. They are types of people. They're types, if you will, right? When in our lives have we been like Judas ourselves? When in our lives have we been like Peter, denying Christ? When in our lives have we been like Simon of Cyrene or Veronica? When in our lives have we been like Pilate or like Dismas or the other criminal? Yikes. So certainly a lot of fruit for our Lenten reflection. Enough for one night? Join us 7:00 p.m. for the Stations of the Cross. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and forever shall be, a world without end. Amen.